Thank you, Charlie. This time I'd like to invite Charlotte Mahoney and Kevin O'Brien to the podium, two friends of Jim's and also two members of the ISN board to present the award.
Well, Kevin and I now have the honor of presenting the award. And Jim, in recognition of your significant leadership on social justice throughout your ministry, and on behalf of Ignatian Solidarity Network, we are so proud and so honored, I feel like I'm going to cry, to present you with the 2014, it's interesting, 2004 was when ISN was founded, so that's the Holy Spirit. So the 2014 Robert M. Holstein Award, Faith Doing Justice. Congratulations, Jim, and thank you.
Well, what can I say? Except to refute all the wonderful things that were said about me. I'm an old debater at heart, you know. No, I'm extremely grateful to be here. And I think it was wonderful that we had the opportunity to celebrate a Eucharist this morning, which means, as I said this morning, thanks. It's a Eucharistic, word, and it's a Eucharistic celebration we're having. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I thank you for being here. I've been thanked for being, for doing what I've done. But we're all here to thank the Lord, because everything we've done has been given. Whatever it is, has been created lovingly and generously and handed on to us for our custodianship. And we care for it. The other thing is we all are one. We are all brothers and sisters. I sometimes think if we pushed, our genealogy back about 6 or 7 or 8 generations, we'd find out we are blood related, And I've written extensively on the essentially social nature of our human community together. We all are brothers and sisters. And the call that Christ gives us to live as kingdom members means let's be family members. All of us here, all of the people that we all know and love and work with and have, had opportunities to become acquainted with in the course of our lives, these are all here too with us. And expand it out, and expand it out, and expand it out. And the next thing you know, there is no one who is not our brother or sister. And I don't care what their income is. I don't care what their background is. I don't care whether they were villains or whether they were, beatified by Rome as saints. They're all kith and kin. They're all our brothers. And I think that is so important for us to remember. What is it to live justly? It's just to recognize that you're my brother. I don't care if you're sitting on the gutter. I don't care if you're drunk. I don't care if you're just living off handouts. You're my brother. You're my brother. What can I do for you? And many a time I saw that when we were walking down, when I was pastor of Holy Trinity, walking down Wisconsin Avenue, and we'd see people on the corners there of M Street as it cut across. Said, this is my brother. What can I do for my brother? And when I was pastor, we decided we did not want to just be giving handouts for knocks at the door. That's when we established that center for gracious concern and social justice and relief of suffering for the poor. And it was just south of M Street. I don't know whether it's still there now, but we had an ecumenical religious community. We had Episcopals, we had Catholics, we had Baptists, you name it. We all would meet together. We would gather as a community about once a month. We would have, with coffee together in the latter part of the afternoon. And then we used to go and participate in the worship ceremonies of one another's churches. I had no hesitation about receiving communion, when it was being decided. Who am I not to eat the body of the Lord, in a Baptist church? Or, I'm beginning to sound like Pope Francis. Who am I to say? So I think this is absolutely at the core of what we're talking about in justice. What is justice? It's to know our familyhood with all of us together. So to have that whole idea, as I say, of our essentially social nature. I could go on and articulate a number of experiences which I think have given me a passion for it. Let me just run through a few things. As I said to some of you earlier on, my father used to say, 2 terrible things happened to our family. In 1929, I lost all my money, and you were born. 1929 was the Great Depression, of course. It made 2008 look like nothing. And we grew up in poverty. I didn't realize how poor we were, but I was just mentioning my mother's grandfather, he was president of the Bell Telephone Company in New York City. He was loaded. Lived in a 2-story penthouse on Park Avenue. I didn't realize for years later he paid the rent of the house in Philadelphia where we lived. We had nothing. So my father was telling the truth in 1929. And it helped, I used to have to cut grass when I was a little kid, get $1 a lawn from a house, and so on, in order to have some money available. I remember as a young high school student, and by the way, I got into St. Joe's Prep High School because my brother won a full scholarship. He's bright, not me. And my father went down and said, I'm not going to have one boy at this fancy prep school and another boy in some public school around the corner. Either they're both here on scholarship or neither one of them. So that's how I got to be at St. Joe's Prep, and I've resented it ever since because otherwise I'd never be a Jesuit, I'd have a real life, And so we used to have to pick up money wherever we could. And I remember in the summer when I was in high school, I was 14, 15. My grandfather, by the way, also owned a big, beautiful 3-story home right on the beach in Long Beach Island at Beach Haven. And my mother was the housekeeper for the summer. She was the eldest of 6 children. And so they used to come and go. So we lived on the beach in my grandfather's home all summer long. That's why I have skin cancer to this day. But the point of it was that I had to work every summer that I went to the shore. And I was so blessed. I worked for a mason by the name of Pete Lane. Pete was about 70 years old at the time when I was about 14 or 15. And he not only taught me how to lay sidewalks and brick and plaster walls and build chimneys and all sorts of stuff like that. He also introduced me to his gang, And sometimes we used to lay stuff in street, repair potholes and things like that, or build sidewalks or put in brick lining along the sidewalk. I got to know all these guys, and they were bums. And I loved them. And they loved me, and we worked so well together. But it was solidarity with the poor. It was a great life experience, really to be a companion with these ordinary guys, whose language would be deeply embarrassing for us here now. But it was a great experience, to have that as a young boy. And I think even in the course of my own Jesuit training, I remember when I was at Wernersville, after I had entered, for some reason or another, I got to be a good friend of one of the priests there, Father Dominic Hammer. He's saying, I'm an immigrant. He came over from Germany years and years before that time, and he had charge of the grounds. And he appointed me as the senior of the grounds. the guy who would oversee the work of the other novices. I had to go with him, and we'd see what needed to be done, what lawns needed to be cut, what maybe walls needed to be built, or what trees needed to be planted. And we would lay out the work for the novices who would have to work on the grounds for an hour every afternoon, 5 or 6 days a week. I also got to know a guy by the name of Oscar Beakey. Oscar was the layman who oversaw with Father Dom Hammer the grounds and so on and so forth. And Oscar got to be one of my really great buddies. I used to hang out when it was snowy, and like we've had this winter, I used to go up to the barn into Oscar's office, and we would sit there and he would tell me stories and give me good advice. And we would sneak downtown and go in with sit down with his wife. He had a small home down there. I was part of the family. And I remember telling my brother, who had entered a year before me in the Jesuits, I don't think I want to be a priest. I really want to work with my hands. I said, I think I'll become a Jesuit brother and work on the grounds. He said, you lazy bum. He said, I'm going to give you a good kick, and you know where. So I got terrified enough to go on for priesthood. Anyway, I could go on and on and on, but I always felt that I had a very good formation process by reason of the people that I met, that I worked with, that I really cared about. I felt, as I look back, that I was in solidarity with the poor. Poor in the sense of not much money, not much education, not much opportunity, but great people. Great, who had a much greater influence on me than I could ever have on them. So anyway, I could go on and on and on. But as a result of that, I'll just tick off a couple of things. When I was so blessed that as a scholastic in Regency, I taught at Gonzaga High School in Washington, D.C. I got to know, among other people, Horace McKenna. He was my man. Horace was, at that time, it was an all African-American neighborhood, and it was jam-packed, because right across the street, they didn't have the fancy football field that they have now. They didn't have that open space around them. You know, we were cheek to jowl, and the people really were struggling. You'd have 3 families in one row house. It was really tight in there. But Horace was out there all the time, and we had a very, very paranoid rector of the community. He used to say he had lost his hearing when he was in a concentration camp in the Philippine Islands during the Second World War, and we say it wasn't just your hearing you lost. I think he lost something else. He would not allow Horace to have African Americans come into the rectory of St. Alphonsus Church, Aloysius Church. And so Horace was out on the street, and I used to love to get out there with Horace. What a guy. He was the pastor of the poor. So that was an early experience. You know, I was just 25, 26 years old at that point in time. And then my first appointment after ordination was to Loyola College. In those days, it was a simple college. There were 800 boys, no women, and the tuition was $800 a year. Now we have about, how many thousands of students, I don't know. It's co-educational. There's dormitories all over and residences all over the campus. And the tuition is $52,000 a year. So anyway, it was a little different when I taught there years ago. But that was at the time when there was all sorts of racial stuff going on. There was a Bull Connor down in North Carolina. And he went after Martin Luther King, had him jailed for trying to break down segregation within movies and within restaurants and so on and so forth. And if you may remember, some of you, that the riots broke out throughout the cities up and down the coast. And Baltimore it was terrible. We had the black, hostility. And it got to the point where by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, everything needed to be closed. Nobody was allowed on the streets. You couldn't drive off to a restaurant for dinner. And so at that time, I remember I got a phone call from a pastor of a parish in the center city, Joe Conley at St. Gregory's, Lord rest him. He said, Jim, we want to have a demonstration. Can you pick up some kids from Loyola to come on down, and we're going to have a march for the poor and for the black in Baltimore. I said, well, I'll see what I can do. We got 300 or 400 kids. And I went down, and it was the first time in my life that I ever got spat upon, in my clerics, as a Catholic priest marching with the kids. Well, out of that they organized a group. They called themselves the Loyola Students for Social Action, LSSA. And they did fantastic work. These kids actually were, some of them from very wealthy families. There's a family by the name of Knott in Baltimore. Some of you in Baltimore would know the Knott family. In fact, there's about 3 or 4 buildings on the university campus there in Baltimore now, named after one of the Knotts. Well, there was a couple of Knott boys at that time in school. Their parents were raising Cain, and I was giving them the opportunity to, represent the poor. But it worked out very well, and it was a terrific conversion for them, as it was for me, ever more deeply, involved with social justice and caring for the poor. This tick off, of course, and then we got into the Vietnam War, and it was when I was provincial that there was the demonstrations of the Jesuits, especially the Berrigan brothers. Do you remember them? And Dan Berrigan broke into anyway, he poured blood over draft cards, and he was arrested. They both ended up in jail. I had marchers outside the provincial's, residence saying, "Why don't you dismiss them from the Society of Jesus? What are you going to do?" And so on. Well, I said, I don't know. Who am I to judge? Let's see. I sound more like Pope Francis all the time. And so those demonstrations went on and on and on. Then, as was mentioned before, it was at the invitation of Archbishop Oscar Romero that I really became involved with El Salvador and the terrible tragedies that were going on down there. It was the oppression of the major segment of the population. There are about 2% of the oligarchy that controlled not only all the wealth, all the money, but also the government. And when Oscar Romero went out to visit with the poor peasants one time, after a good Jesuit friend of his had been shot down in the road, Rutilio Grande was a Jesuit, S.J., and he had been gunned down for his support of the poor and the peasants out in the country. Oscar said to himself, I have to go see what's going on here. He went down and was a radical conversion. He had been just a regular archbishop living in his palace someplace, dealing with, regular mass and so on. He was just a radical conversion for the poor. And so, little by little, he began to organize. And I, therefore, heard from him. I was then president of the Jesuit conference, right close to Washington. What can you do? He says. Can you? And Jimmy Carter, nice guy that he was, he didn't see it right. He had it out of perspective. He thought he was being a nice guy, but he wasn't, unfortunately. And I got in touch with the guy at the same time, Cyrus Vance, who was head of the State Department, and we had conversations. We began to organize a group of influential American leaders in religion and elsewhere to make a representation to our government to begin to back off support of the oligarchy and give support to the poor. And that turned out to be a very successful operation. We were able to alleviate the problems and so on. And I visited El Salvador, and I remember one night sitting in the Jesuit community dining room when the 6 or 7 Jesuits were sitting around there, and I looked at the wall, and they were all pockmarked with bullet holes. I said, why don't you do something with those pockmarks? I told him, I said, I used to work for a mason. Maybe I can get some plaster and maybe cover up the holes. They said, oh, forget it. They said, they're going to come by and fire anyway. They're going to put in some more holes. And besides, they said, we look at those holes and we remember why we're here. It's a good remembrance. And who we're here for, it's not for the gunners, it's for the people, the poor people who need us here and give us some support. Of course, little did I realize that those 6 or 7 guys I was having dinner with, they were going to be gunned down too, very quickly, in a few years. And so was the housekeeper and her daughter that were there that evening. And then I went to the Archbishop's funeral, of course, and that was already mentioned. And that all hell broke loose at the funeral, as you know. The man who was giving the homily was just about halfway into his homily when all of a sudden, in this big, round plaza at the front of the church, gunshots started coming down. Boom, boom, brrr, machine guns. And there must have been hundreds of people in this big circular plaza. And they all began to run. The screams, were almost as loud as the gunshots. And that went on for 2 hours. And more people started racing into the church, jamming in to get out of gunshot range. And anyway, even in his funeral, poor Oscar Romero didn't get treated very nicely. Anyway, and then, of course, the great experience I had at the Social Concerns Committee. Paul McElligott, yay, stand up, Paul, take a big cheer. Paul came to see me one day when I was still president of the Jesuit Conference, and he said, Jim, he said, we'd like you to come and give a retreat to the Social Concerns Committee. I said, Paul, for God's sake, as president of this conference, I'm traveling all over the United States. Sometimes I had to go abroad, to travel. So he said, okay. So he left. A week later, he's back. A week after that, he's back again. So I finally said, all right, I'll do it. So I'm so happy that I did, because I made a convert of Nita Crowley. In fact, we drove down together. Remember Nita and David and Paul and myself? We all drove down to make this retreat. It was a great experience, and I loved doing it, and I got more out of it than they did. And then we had 2 or 3 more, and then then lo and behold, unbeknownst to myself, I got a phone call saying, Jim, we got a new assignment for you. What's that? Holy Trinity. Oh my God. And the first time I got up in the pulpit, there was the whole Social Concerns Committee sitting in the front rows. And I got a standing ovation. But we did I was so happy to continue that work with Social Concerns, under Paul, and with Nita and a number of other terrific people. Boy, oh boy. Talk about getting down there, down and dirty, with the poor, solidarity with the poor. So that was a great experience. And then, of course, went on up to Georgetown to the Woodstock Theological Center. There we got into a number of key issues having to do with poverty, having to do with relations, especially relations with the government. We did a project on lobbying. I've always said Wall Street runs K Street, and K Street runs the government. Money makes the world go around, and so how about lobbying? So we did a major project on lobbying. I was greatly assisted because my brother at that time was lobbying for General Electric, And I disliked him immensely, so I was glad to criticize and ridicule him. But in any case, that was one of the projects we did, and it all grew out of the Social Concerns Committee and the commitment that we had, to pursue justice, the willingness to struggle. And I'll just shut up now saying I spend a lot of time with students at Loyola University who are going on for these immersion experiences that were just discussed. They want me to tell them stories about what's it like to be overseas. What are we doing? I have one coming up now. I usually say a send-off mass for them as they get away. And I also usually give them a couple of different talks about what to be looking for. What is it like to be in genuine immersion, with the poor people? Because when they go down there, they're not falderal, They're dressed very simply. They're supposed to live very warmly and openly and genuinely with the poor people that they're there to serve. Sometimes their best service is simply presence and affection and some sort of a sense of appreciation. for the very, very poor. So anyway, I must say, finally, that I am deeply grateful to the Lord for allowing me, enabling me, and almost pushing me to the life experiences that I've had. There's nothing that was self-inflicted. Much less was there anything that I could see coming in advance. It was just by the gracious, guidance of the Lord, step by step by step, that I think I was able to get some sense of what it is to be poor and to appreciate what my father meant when he said in 29. Two terrible things happened. So I was so grateful to be born into poverty.